Started. Thank you so much for coming out of term to this event. Tim Pawl, a colleague of mine for a number of years, was traveling through the United Kingdom, was up at St. Andrews, and so we grabbed him when we found out we could have him. He is a professor of philosophy at the Department of Philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. He works on metaphysics, philosophical theology, and moral psychology. And metaphysics and philosophical theology has done work on truth makers, especially in relationship to divine simplicity. And more recently has moved into the areas of moral psychology, and we've been on some group collaborative projects and things along those lines. He has 3 monographs, which are probably well known to many of you. In 2016, he published the In Defense of Conciliar Christology, a philosophical essay, which was published in the Oxford Studies in Analytic Theology series. And then back by popular demand came out the 2nd volume a few years later in 2019, In Defense of Extended Conciliar Christology, a philosophical essay. And then in 2020, his volume, The Incarnation, came out in the Cambridge Elements series. And we're very delighted to have Tim here for a few days. Just arrived this morning, hot off the train not too long ago. And today we'll be speaking on Aquinas truth and postmodernism. So thank you, Tim.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Ought I to be speaking into this microphone for the sake of the... I'm good like this? All right. Wonderful. All right. So thank you for coming. As Daniel said, it is after term for you guys, and you're all still here. So I don't know what accounts for that. Maybe you're just all lovers of wisdom, and you think maybe I've got some for you. We'll see. We'll see how that goes. But thanks for coming. Here are the things I'd like us to do today. I've got a summary of it. I'm going to present a Thomistic theory of truth. So if the talk's on Aquinas and truth and postmodernism, I want to get clear on Aquinas' view of truth before I move on to postmodernism and some objections it raises. Secondly, I want to talk about how Aquinas talked about predications concerning God. And there I'll distinguish multiple different types of predications that are made of God. For instance, predications with respect to the incarnation. You can say God is a man. You could say God died. Those are both true according to Aquinas and traditional Christianity. And third, I want to talk about 4 types of positive, non-incarnational predicates that I think do seem to allow for univocal predication of both God and creatures. Gasp. That's not what you're supposed to say in this room. But we'll see what happens. And now that I've said it, I want to tell you ahead of time, I'm going to try to alleviate some worries that might arise when one says there could be possibly univocal predications with respect to both God and creatures. And the alleviation is going to come in part, I hope, through looking at a text from Aquinas where he talks about a different area, but about univocal predications between distinct sorts of things. And then finally, I'm going to consider 2 objections that arise from postmodernism with respect to the previous parts of the talk from Deleuze and Milbank, and talk about how I think they fail with respect to what they're objecting to. So the postmodernism bit comes in at the end as a series of objections to raise against the sort of view I'd like to argue for during the talk. So that's what I'm up to. First then, Aquinas on truth. I think he's got 2 main points. I wrote my dissertation with Eleanor Stump on Aquinas on truth a lifetime ago. I know it's a lifetime ago because I have old children who were not yet alive at that point. So a lifetime ago I wrote this, and there's 2 main things I want to say about it. I'll tell you what they are now, tell you a bit more with some Thomistic texts about it in a moment. But first, that Aquinas has what you might think of as an adequation or conformity notion of truth. Something similar to, but not identical to, a correspondence theory of truth. And I'll say why I think that in a moment. And it's not pragmatic or coherentist or a deflationary account of truth. It's a robust theory of truth, the sort you find in Aristotle. I'll say more about it in a moment. And secondly, this conformity that Aquinas gives us, it's symmetric, it's necessarily symmetric, but there's a priority on the part of reality. And I'll tell you what that means from some texts from Aquinas and Aristotle as well. To the first, here's something Aquinas says, you're probably familiar with this. Truth is defined as the conformity between intellect and reality, or between thought and thing, you might say. You get something right, Aristotle says, when you say of what is that it is, or of what's not that it's not. And you get something wrong when you say of something that's not that it is, or something that is, that it's not. In other words, you get it right when what you say conforms to how it is. Now, I say it's not necessarily a correspondence theory, just because correspondence theories are most often put in terms of there being a correspondent out there in the world for any true proposition. So Tim is talking, that proposition Tim is talking is true because it corresponds to something out there, a fact about how Tim is. And I think Aquinas doesn't always have a thing on the other side, a thing there like the fact to which the truth corresponds. So I think a correspondence theory of truth most often is put in terms of a real thing out there existing which corresponds to the proposition. And I think Aquinas doesn't necessarily go that far. And just one bit of evidence of him not going that far you can find in the Disputed Questions on Truth, where he says this. He says, in this commiseration or conformity of intellect to thing, or intellect and thing, it is not necessary that each of the two actually exist. Our intellect can be in conformity with things that, although not now existing, will exist in the future. Otherwise, it would not be true to say that, quote, the Antichrist will be born, end quote. The point here is the following. Aquinas thinks you can sometimes have truths, and so conformity or adequation of thought to reality, even if the reality to which your mind is conformed isn't yet there, even if it's not. And so this sort of view, unlike a standard correspondence view, doesn't require the correspondent to exist. And that's why I want to draw a distinction there. If you think correspondence theories don't require a thing out there, like I'm suggesting, I think most of them do, but if you think they don't have to, then I'm fine with you saying Aquinas is also a correspondence theorist. Secondly, here's a long quotation. They're not all going to be that much text, I promise you. Here's a long quotation from Aristotle. Aristotle says, there being a man reciprocates as to implication of existence with the true statement about it. What's that mean? It means if there is a man, the statement whereby we say that there is a man is true. And reciprocally, since if the statement whereby we say that there is a man is true, then there is a man. And whereas a statement, the true statement, is in no way the cause of the actual thing's existence, here's the important bit, that's why I italicized it, the actual thing does seem in some way the cause of the statement's being true. It is because the actual thing exists or not that the statement is called true or false. The point here then is just that you get a necessary biconditional. You get a necessary implication both directions. The proposition's truth implies the world is that way. The world's being that way implies the proposition is truth. So there's a symmetry there, but there is a priority. There's a groundedness. The way the world is grounds how the truth is, and not vice versa for Aquinas. And that's an important point, I think, in postmodern discussions. First, foremost, grounded in how the world is. Second, derivatively, how the truths are. Aquinas says the same sort of thing. Here's just one quotation where he does, again, from the Disputed Questions on Truth. He says, truth, which is in the soul but caused by things, does not depend on what one thinks, but on the existence of things. For it is because a thing is or is not that a statement is said to be true or false. There you see he's just following the Aristotelian line from the previous slide. So the main points I want to raise about Aquinas' theory of truth is just that it's a conformity or adequation theory with a necessary entailment both directions from world to reality, but with a groundedness, first comes world or reality, second comes truth. Truth depends on the world. Now, the second thing I told you I wanted to do was to talk a bit about predications with respect to God. So if you have a general theory of how truth works, you might still ask, well, how do you apply this to God? And here I want to talk about three different sorts of divine predications. And I've labeled them just non-shareable, incarnational, and negative predicates. So start with the first. Start with non-shareable. I'll tell you what I mean by these. What's a non-shareable predicate? Well, it's one of the divine prerogatives. It's a predicate that can only truthfully be ascribed to the divine. So maybe omnipotence. When you say God is omnipotent is something that can be said of only one thing out there, just God. Can't be said of anything else. Same with those other examples I have there too. only one entity is simple, at least in the robust sense in which God is simple. So the non-shareable predicates are just the ones that can be truthfully said only of God. You could say them of other things if you wanted to. Like, look at that guy. You could say, Daniel, oh, Daniel, you're covering your head now. I apologize for what's coming in the future. You could say Daniel's omnipotent. You could say it. Meaningful, but it's just false. That's the way the world works. So I'm not saying non-shareable as if there's a way of stopping you from asserting it of another subject, another linguistic subject. I'm just saying that when asserting of a different linguistic subject, you'll have a false predication. Secondly, how about incarnational predications? Well, what are the predicates said of both humans and of Christ with respect to his humanity? So, for instance, we say that St. Peter is a man. We say St. Peter was crucified. We say St. Peter died. With each of those three, we say a truth. What if we say Christ was a man? Christ was crucified. Christ died. Those predicates, is a man, is crucified, or was crucified, died. Those three predicates are said of both Jesus with respect to his humanity and God. Nope. Jesus with respect to his humanity and Peter. That's what I meant. And the question arises, well, do we use those terms univocally there? We can't use omnipotent univocally of Daniel and God, or we can try, but we just fail. Can we use died univocally of Peter and Jesus? And here Aquinas says, yes, most assuredly you can. He says, this name, man, is said univocally of Christ and of Peter, because it signifies one nature in both, namely human, namely the human nature, composed from a body and a soul. But in Christ, it, that is the term man, it supposits an eternal suppositum, that's an ugly way of translating, I'm sorry, which it does not supposit in Peter. It supposits, it points to, it designates eternal hypostasis, an eternal person, which it doesn't when it supposits or Peter. It doesn't when you refer to Peter. But the important point's at the top there. Aquinas emphatically wants to say that the things you say of Christ as a human, because he's a true, real man, are the same sorts of things you say of a true, real man like me. A third type of predicate. We've got the non-shareable variety. We've got the incarnational variety. How about negative predicates? Well, take a predicate that describes how something is. Like is a cat. And form a predicate that is satisfied if and only if it does not satisfy the original predicate. That is, if and only if it is in the anti-extension of the original predicate. You've got a term cat. It points at only these things over here. And then you can just stipulate. And anything not pointed at by cat, by the word cat, is a non-cat. So you have a negative term there, formed not by stipulating how the thing is, but merely by stipulating how the thing is not. God is a non-cat. It's true. And I think it's true for the very same reason that Daniel is a non-cat is true. They're both true because things fail to satisfy the conditions for being a cat. I don't know what those conditions are. Felinity? Call it that. You know, my cats, I have two at home. Those two, I mean, they're not at home now. They're being watched by somebody. It'd be cruel if I were out here touring the UK and my cats were still languishing at home. But their cats, Daniel's not a cat and God's not a cat either. And the reason they're both cats is the same sort of reason. The idea here is just the following. This tells you how God is not. It doesn't tell you some positive way God is. And so it's an okay sort of thing to say a God univocally of God and of Daniel, because you're not telling me anything specific about how he is. You're just telling me that there's one thing he isn't. Same with immaterial. You're not telling me some positive way God is. You're saying he's not a certain way that other things are. So the sort of predicates I want to talk about for the remainder of the talk are what you might call shared, so truthfully assertable of both God, but also of at least one creature, unlike omnipotent. So shared, non-incarnational, so not true of Christ in virtue of his human nature, and positive, not negative like non-cat or immaterial. I want to focus then on these. I'm not going to say it over and over and over again, but I just want you to realize I'm focusing on shared, non-incarnational, positive predicates. I wonder about those. You might ask, can we say those of both God and creature univocally? And here Aquinas has an answer. Here Aquinas says univocal predication is impossible between God and creatures. And of course, there he doesn't mean the Christological predications we talked about. He doesn't mean the negative ones. He means these positive, shareable, non-incarnational predicates. Well, if it's not univocal, what's it mean? What's it mean when you say God is wise and Daniel is wise, or God is good and Daniel is good? Here's what he says. He says, this is a quote from him. So when we say God is good, the meaning is not God is the cause of goodness, or God is not evil, but the meaning is whatever good we attribute to creatures pre-exists in God, and in a more excellent and higher way. That's what we mean when we say God is good. Okay, so that's just, the first bit was about what Aquinas means by truth. The second bit was just clearing out some sorts of predications I don't want us to focus on. Non-shareable, incarnational, and negative predicates. And saying, let's focus on these positive ones. And let's try to think of some reasons, or I'm going to try to think of some reasons, for why it might be the case that at least some predicates that are positive, non-incarnational, and shareable, why some of them might be univocally said of both Daniel and God, or, anything in God. And again, there's a part coming later where I say, but don't worry, don't panic. And that's coming. So I've got 4 different sorts of arguments I want to give. Some from disjunction. I'll specify these all a bit later. Some from the non-satisfaction of an already negative predicate. Some from graded predicates. And some from predicates that only require something on the part of something else. A predicate said of me, but that only requires something on the part of another. I'll give an example of that. To the first, disjunctive predicates. Consider disjunctive predicates we form in the process of analysis. So consider the predicate has a stroke of a person. You say somebody has a stroke, and it turns out there's 2 fairly different things that can occur to a person, which are both referred to as having a stroke. So when you're trying to figure out what happened to the person, it might be that he had a clot somewhere in his brain, or it might be that he had a rupture and a bleed somewhere in his brain. And either one of those things we call having a stroke. The stroke ward in Memorial Hospital is full of people that fulfill both those different ontological conditions for the term has a stroke. The idea here is we have a predicate, and then when we analyze it, we see, oh, there's 2 distinct ways you might satisfy the predicate. Having a bleed or having a clot are both ways of satisfying the predicate has a stroke. And secondly, you might form a new predicate that's composed of 2. Bill Wood, I wasn't sure if he was going to be here, but William Wood has a recent book where he talks about the predicate bleen is what he stipulates. And something is bleen when it is blue or it is green. There you have a predicate formed by disjoining together 2 different predicates. So something is this when it satisfies either A or B. And here it's something is bleen when it satisfies either blue or green. Well, consider another predicate you might disjoin together. Another predicate you might put an or in, and so form a new predicate. Take one you might call inclusively good. Something is inclusively good if and only if it is good in the way we attribute to creatures, or such goodness pre-exists in it and is in a more excellent and higher way. That second bit you see is just the way that Aquinas says God is good. So what if you define a conception of goodness called inclusive goodness, which just takes God's way of being good and takes the way creatures are good and put them together, like Bill Wood takes the way of being blue and the way of being green and puts them together. There, it seems to me, you formed a meaningful predicate. Semantically, it can make sense. Linguistically, you can understand the truth conditions for it. And it seems like it's something you could say of both God and of Daniel, for instance. So that's one way of getting a univocal predicate by way of disjunctively just connecting 2 predicates that we already have. How about a second way? Recall that one can form the concept of a non-cat by taking the concept of a cat and stipulating everything not under the extension of that concept satisfies the predicate non-cat. Here, we take a new concept and form we take a concept and form a new one by finding its anti-extension or its complement, its opposite, the stuff that doesn't satisfy it. So that's what I said there of non-cat. It's negative, and so it isn't an instance of a univocal, non-incarnational positive predicate. Non-cat isn't positive. It's pretty clear it's not a positive predicate. But what if you take that same structure, that same mechanism for forming predicate, and start with something that's already a negative predicate? You start with cat, you form its anti-extension. You've got the idea of a non-cat. What if you start with something already negative and form its anti-extension? I think we can think of some examples of that. What if we start with one that's already negative? Here's an example. Here's a way you might do it. Here's a predicate we already have, an interloper. You might think of that as just something that does not belong where it is. I was an interloper when I tried to walk into Christ Church this afternoon. I walked in and I was stopped by somebody in a very fancy outfit and told I couldn't be there, which was fine. It was the person's job. But I realized, oh, right, I'm interloping in this situation. Well, take that predicate and suppose I take its extension, all the things that are interlopers, and I form its anti-extension, all the other stuff. And I stipulate a predicate for all the other stuff there, like I did for non-cat when I stipulated a predicate that applies to all the stuff that's not cats. How about loper? Anything at all that does belong where it is a loper there. So if you're in the courtroom and there's a judge in there and there's a defendant in there, they're both lopers in the room because they both belong there. If the protesters storm in, they're not lopers. We have a word for what they are. They're interlopers. See how loper and interloper are related to one another. Anything that belongs where it is a loper there. Now at Mass, I think it's true to say God is a loper. He's not an interloper. And it's true to say Tim is a loper, too. We're both things that belong where we are. If you think, Tim, you think you're worthy of being at Mass? I think, no, but I'm commanded to be there. And if you're commanded to be there, there's a sense in which you belong there, right? So there's a sense in which we're both belonging where we are. And that's just one example. You can think of others, too, where you take a negative predicate, form its anti-extension, give a term to that, and then apply it to different things. How about a third example of a univocal style predicate? This is graded predicates. Consider predicates that are set on a scale. Two things can be hot, but one more hot than the other, or wet, but more wet than the other, or good, but more good than the other. So the lava is hot, and the sun is hot, but the sun is hotter than the lava. Right? And that's the way the world works. We can form predicates that are apt of anything on a graded scale too. So it might not just be like hotter than, but it might be above the boiling point of water. And there I can truthfully say of both the sun and of lava that they're both above the boiling point of water. That same predicate applies to both. There's a scale, there's a pinpointed position on the scale, and this predicate applies to anything above the pinpointed position on the scale. All right, what about other predicates though? So consider the predicate at least as good as Daniel. That's a good predicate. Many things satisfy that predicate, at least as good as Daniel. You might ask yourself, does God satisfy the predicate at least as good as Daniel? Well, we saw Aquinas say, whatever good we attribute to creatures pre-exists in God, and in a more excellent and higher way. And then you might ask yourself, you can't have A be more excellent or higher than B if there's no standard at all by which we grade them both according to the feature in question. God can't be more good than Daniel if there's no standard at all to employ to adjudicate the highness or the goodness on the scale of these two. In fact, that's something we find Aquinas say at one point. We find him say it here in the fourth way. In the fourth way, Aquinas says, the fourth way is taken from the gradation to be found in things. Among beings, there are some more and some less good, some more or less true, some more or less noble, and the like. But more and less are predicated of different things according as they resemble in different ways something which is the maximum. Now, the maximum in any genus is the cause of all that's in the genus, and so on and so forth. The important point was just right there, the part I read. But more or less are predicated of different things according as they resemble in their different ways something which is the maximum. So the basic idea here is this. This reasoning requires that God be at the maximum end of the gradation of goodness. And if God, of course, is at the maximal end, God is at least as good as Daniel, who is also on the same scale, but you might think somewhat lower down on the scale than God. And so thus it seems that both God and Daniel fulfill the conditions for being at least as good as Daniel. Finally, a fourth way of getting a univocal predication. Predicates that only require something on the part of another. So some predicates of a grammatical subject can change their truth value without any ontological difference in the grammatical subject. So you might have heard of something called Cambridge changes. I'll tell you a bit more about them in a moment. I'm sorry it's named Cambridge changes and not Oxford changes. I did not set the name myself, I just inherited it. But here we have it. That's the most common example. And the basic idea I'm pointing at here is you can have a sentence of the form subject is predicate, where that sentence changes its truth value without any change in the subject, or without any relevant change in the subject. So for instance, why is it called a Cambridge change? Well, a week and a half ago, there I was in balmy Minnesota in the United States. If you don't know where it is, look on the left-hand side. This is where we keep it these days, Minnesota. And I was in St. Paul. That's the capital of Minnesota. And the internet told me I was around 3,989 miles from Cambridge. And here I am today. And again, trusting the internet on this topic, I'm about 66 miles from Cambridge. Does that sound right to you guys? I don't even know if that's true, but that's what the web has told me, so I stuck with it. The point, though, is this. The city of Cambridge isn't the thing that changed in this. So it's true to say a week and a half ago, Cambridge is 3,900 and some miles from Tim. Now it's true to say Cambridge is 66 miles from Tim. But it's not in virtue of Cambridge being different that this predication changes its truth value. It's only true in virtue of my change. Or if you think, well, technically there's no such thing as the city of Cambridge, pick your favorite substance near the center of the city of Cambridge, some bronze statue that you know of and love. Let that thing be the thing I'm talking about. You know, I changed my position with respect to that, but that thing didn't change any relevant predicates in virtue of which, or relevant features in virtue of which it changed that subject of the predication. Aquinas is okay with this sort of thing. Here's something he says, in Summa, he says, there is nothing to prevent these names, which ones he says Lord and Creator, these names which import relation to the creature, from being predicated of God temporally, not by reason of any change in him, but by reason of the change of the creature. As a column is on the right of an animal without changing in itself, but by change in the animal. You know, the animal walks to the right side of the column, I guess the left side of the column's to the right of it. But the animal walks to the other side of the column doesn't change, but the statement changes its truth value. Okay, how does this apply? Well, I think it applies like this. Take a predicate, is being thought about by Daniel. Now, that's a predicate that I think right now is applying to me. There I am, being thought about by Daniel. So Tim is being thought about by Daniel is true. But when that's true, it doesn't require any difference in me. If you had a metaphysical monocle you can put on to look at me and see what's going on under the metaphysical hood, so to speak, in the substance and accidents that I have. When he starts thinking about me, there isn't some new accident that inheres in me being thought about by Daniel. All the change in the reality, all the ontological difference is found on the Daniel side of the equation. And if in the part of my droning on this, he starts thinking back on that delicious looking ice cream that he had in that previous picture, he starts daydreaming about it, there's no change in me when the thing he's thinking about goes from being Tim to being Daniel. So a question you might ask is the predicate is being thought about by Daniel ever properly said of God? And here you might think, well, I sure hope so. The man goes to Mass. Surely he says daily prayers. He's thinking about God sometimes. Is it said in a more excellent way than it's said of me? Well, I don't know if a predicate like this has to be said more excellently of God than it is of me. It's not applying any excellence to God at all. It's not like a less excellence if it's said the same way of me and of God. So it seems to me, and I'm stipulating here, that this is a reverent picture of the divine. I didn't know a better one to offer you for the Trinity, so I gave you that one. God is being thought about by Daniel seems to me to be univocally, the predicate seems to be univocally used there, as when you say here, Tim is being thought about by Daniel. Okay, I've given you 4 different ways you might form a predicate that seems to me at least to be univocally employed instead of God and instead of, what was my example? Daniel, instead of Daniel. So what's the moral to draw here? And Daniel, give a thumbs up if you think it's right. Okay. So, predicates can be stipulated in whatever way one wants. I think I've got my last invitation to speak from Daniel. You can stipulate these however you want to. And as a consequence, some predicates are univocal of both me and of God, or of Daniel and of God. This seems to me like this what I've said so far should not be a big deal. But it is seen as a big deal, I think. So I next try to diminish the felt bigness of the deal. That's where we're off to next. And I want to take you to a place early in his career where Aquinas thinks about the concept body and what he says of that concept there. So he divides three ways something is said according to analogy. He says with respect to intention, there I think the word is ratio, but not existence. With respect to existence and not intention, so one or the other, or with respect to both. Why not a fourth? If you're carving out logical space in your mind, there's a fourth option here I haven't listed, with respect to neither. But then, of course, if it's with respect to neither, it wouldn't be analogous usage. So you only get three different ways of getting analogous usage here. And when he talks about the first, with respect to intention but not existence, his standard example there is the Aristotelian example of health. The idea here is that the ratio, the conception, the intention, as is translated here, is different when I say broccoli is healthy and Daniel is healthy. But what you need in reality, what is pointing to in reality, a properly functioning human organism, say, when talking about humans. That's the same sort of thing in both cases. In the broccoli case, we're saying broccoli is a cause of a properly functioning human organism. And in the Daniel case, where Daniel's healthy, we're just saying he's a properly functioning human organism. And his example with respect to intention and existence is the word being. He says the word being has a greater perfection when said of substances than it does of accidents. And he also says in the same passage that the existence differs because, of course, on Thomas's view, substances and accidents exist in different sorts of ways. Their act of existing is different, or the ways in which they exist is different. Now I'm going to give you what I think is the most text over the course of the slides here, because I want to talk for a while about this passage right here. He says a second way of speaking analogously is with respect to existence and not intention. So remember here, you have a difference with respect to what's out there in the world, but not in the meaning of the term, not in the ratio of the term. And this happens when many things are equivalent in the intention of something common, but the common thing does not have an existence of one notion in all of them. For example, all bodies are equivalent in the intention of corporeity. This is why the logician, this is important, this is why the logician, who considers only intentions, says that this name, body, is predicated of all bodies univocally. But the existence of this nature is not of the same notion in incorruptible and incorruptible bodies. Once as regards the metaphysician and natural scientist, who consider realities according to their own existence, neither this name, body, nor anything else is said univocally of corruptible and incorruptible things, as is clear in the metaphysics and in the commentator. Okay, the point, well, one point you could think of here is, well, look, he says neither this name, body, nor anything else is said univocally of corruptible and incorruptible things. Remember, Aquinas had a view of the heavenly bodies where they were of a different genus entirely from mundane bodies like a flower. Mars was a different sort of thing entirely than terrestrial things. So part of this is just building on his view of what the natural sciences taught at the time. But I think this shows us that nothing said univocally of both isn't something specific to just God. It's not that God has this vaulted status where we don't say the same word of both God and creatures. The same sort of move is made with respect to corruptible and incorruptible substances, which I find interesting. Secondly, or maybe the first of two more, the metaphysician and the logician, from what he says here, have different concepts of body. As one and the same concept but can't both include and preclude the very same things in its extension at the same time. That is, the metaphysician uses the word body such that it only captures one or the other, but not univocally both, the terrestrial things and the extraterrestrial things like Mars. But the logician uses the word body, and when he uses the word body, he uses it univocally of both terrestrial things and heavenly things. So there's different concepts of body at work here. And second, even for Aquinas, some univocal concepts, like the logician's concept of body, do not require ontological sameness to apply univocally across instances. Here he says explicitly, there's no ontological sameness for the heavenly bodies and the mundane terrestrial bodies, and yet, at least for the logician, you have the very same term being univocally applied to both. So univocal predication, at least in some instances, doesn't require ontological sameness for the univocal predication. Now, if that's true, you might get somebody playing devil's advocate. I saw this in Edinburgh, and I thought, I want to take a picture next to that, the devil's advocate. So suppose someone were to say to Aquinas the following. Suppose he says, hey, why not grant something similar about God and creatures to what you say concerning the heavenly and earthly bodies when considered by the logician? The logicians have terms that apply univocally to both, even though there is not ontological sameness on your view between heavenly bodies and earthly bodies. The logic chopping analytics want to use similarly univocal terms in the theological discussion. Why can't they? So that's an objection to the Thomistic sort of view put from the devil's advocate to the left. And here's a Thomistic response, and for the record, I like this sort of response. You might think that theology, along with metaphysics and natural theology, you might think of them all as sciences in the traditional notion of science. They are getting at the nature of things. That's what they're up to. We need the concepts to express perspicuously the ontological reality there to make headway in a science. And so I want to give you an analogy in the hopes of showing the importance of relying on this analogical language, even if it's still possible to have univocal terms said of God and creatures. Even if that's still possible, it's still important to use the analogical language. And I want to look at civil engineering as an example. So consider this analogy. Think of the many words we use for measuring strength of a substance. And the lay folk like me, we run them all together, don't we? Like, I can say the aluminum is strong, and this weave is strong, and the cement is strong, and the steel is strong. And I realize that there's some sorts of force you can't put on cement that you can put on steel. And it's important to put steel through your cement so it doesn't crack in certain ways. It makes it stronger. But I don't really understand how to define all that stuff, to be honest. And so I went to Wikipedia. I went to one Wikipedia page and found these different notions of strength. I'm not going to read any of them because what they mean isn't so important to me. But what's important to me is there's the lay conception of strength, and then there's the conception that you find used by the civil engineers. And the Thomist might say to the person pressing this objection, might say, and I apologize for the crass language on the left slide, but I thought it was too good to pass up. You might say, for those who want to get deeper into understanding civil engineering, why don't they just revert to the lay univocal terms they had before taking any engineering courses? Why not do that? And of course, I think the answer is the engineers need these distinctions between tensile and shear strength, for instance. They need them, and they won't learn anything much of use. In fact, they'll really mess it up if they stick with just the plain strength they had and didn't disambiguate in important ways. That is, in other words, for the civil engineer to get ahead, to really understand reality, you can't just rely on the univocal terms like the logician uses, a body, which is true of the terrestrial and also the heavenly bodies. you need to get more focused on the ontology of the situation, not merely the semantics, like when you disjoin together two predicates, but on how the world really is, you have to get clear on. And so even if it's true that you can form these general terms that are univocally said, like the word strength is univocally said of all these different ways of being strong, that's not really helpful when you want to understand how to build a bridge. You're going to goof it up if all you use is the layperson's conception of strength when you're trying to build a bridge. And so likewise, you might think when applied to God, the moral looks like this. It's the natural philosophers, not the logicians' notion of body that leads to a deep understanding of mundane and heavenly bodies. It's the civil engineers, not my notion of strength, that leads to deep understanding of the physical properties of objects. So likewise for thinking about God, the univocal and the general understandings of our concepts will not lead us to a deep understanding of reality. You can stick with a disjunctive notion of goodness, good in this way or that way or that way, but it's not going to help you understand more deeply God's goodness. That's the cost, you might think. That's the cost for thinking more clearly and getting more deeply into the truth. You get an increase in terms that are related analogously, but that carve reality more deeply at its joints. You might think of it also as the benefit. Not merely a cost, but a benefit. Okay. Finally, I said to you, the last thing I intended to do was talk about univocal predication in postmodern theology. Because what I've done here is I've said there are some univocal predications that could apply to both God and creatures. But importantly, they're not the sort you want to use in your theology because they don't get you very far in the theology. In fact, they might lead to a hot mess, just like using strength would lead to a hot mess if it's just a layperson's notion of strength. But there are some objections out there against univocal predication that you find in postmodern theology. And I want to talk about two of them and a response to them. And they're both found in the work of John Milbank. And one is that it inaugurates secular reasoning, that is the use of univocal predications and univocal terms between God and creatures inaugurates secular reasoning. I'll tell you what that means more in a moment. And the second is it undermines the hierarchy of being. He gets that from Deleuze. Consider the first. Here's a quotation taken from Loom and Milbank from just 2022. It's recent. It's in the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology, which I think is a great resource you might look into if you're inclined. They say this, and this is a quotation right here. Formally speaking, what this, that is, the acceptance of univocal predication, means is that one can make direct references to being without necessarily also referring to God at the same time. As such, the univocity of being opens up the conceptual space where one can freely think about reality and being without God, thereby inaugurating what may be called, quote, secular reason. And that emphasis there is theirs. Okay, what to make of these claims? What to make of the objection? Well, one little tricky bit is just referring. The word refer does some different sorts of work here, so we have to be a bit careful. We see that referring is done to a concept, to the concept of being. That's what the single quote mark means, is referring to the concept. And it also is being done to God. So it's the sort of thing you do to a word or a semantic element and also to God. And we go from referring to a concept, that is a concept of being and God, to thinking about being, not the concept, apparently, as it lacks a single quotes up here, and God. I'll move my, yeah, good, great. So we go from talking about being the notion to, well, whatever that refers to, not merely a concept, but what the concept refers to. It looks like a bit of intellectual slippage going on there. And finally, you might ask yourself here, before I go on and assess it, just, I wonder about this. He says, it means that one can make direct references to being without necessarily also referring to God at the same time. And I think, doesn't everybody think you can do that already? Here's a sentence that I think is true. The concept, being, is not a donut. That's true. Does that refer to God necessarily? I don't see that it does. So if the charge against using univocal terms is that it allows you to refer to the concept being without referring to God, I think that charge applies to everybody who uses the concept being, because the concept is such that it doesn't necessarily refer to God. But secondly, I want to say this. The quotation strikes me as precisely backwards in the following way. Consider, suppose that you deny that the concept being is univocal, and I affirm it is. Just suppose that's the way this dialectic is set up. And now ask, what are we doing when we use the word being? What am I doing? I who use it univocally of God and creatures in this example. Whenever I use the term being, I intend for its extension to include God. When I refer with the word being, I'm catching God in my, what you might call linguistic lasso, just like I'm catching my shoes. Each is a sort of not nothing. And insofar as it's not nothing, it's a being. The low-grade notion of being, just a not nothing. Now, what are you doing? Whenever you use the term being, as you do in your everyday existence, navigating the world, you intend for its extension to preclude God. When you refer with the word being, you're not catching God in your linguistic lasso along with your shoes. We've got a usage of the term being, our most common and standard usage, that does not include God. Oopsie, pardon me. So it looks to me like if one of these two notions is going to be such that it doesn't necessarily include God in the picture, doesn't necessarily refer to God, I think it's not the one that says being can also apply to God. It's the one that says it doesn't apply to God. That's the one that's not referring to God. That's the one that doesn't include God. So the charge, hey, your use of the word being, if you use it of God and of other things, is inaugurating a secular usage where you can use being without referring to God. And I think, well, actually, if anybody is doing that, it looks to me like the person who said being doesn't refer to God at all is the one that's doing it. Second, last. Here's the second objection I wanted to consider. They say, again, Lung and Milbank, they say, according to Deleuze, the Scotus doctrine of univocity represents an equal distribution of being to all beings, even to the most diverse and the most varied beings. Univocal being is immediately present in everything. Whether they are large or small, inferior or superior, none of them participate more or less in being, nor receives it by analogy. Univocity of being thus also signifies equality of being. As such, for Deleuze, the univocity of being undermines the traditional metaphysical schema of the hierarchy of being. Here, Deleuze is claimed to assert that univocity of predicates implies an equal distribution of being to all beings. You might ask, is he right? I've got three things to say about this. First, just focus on that part that I've made red there. The claim is if you use a Scotus doctrine of univocity, whereby the same predicate can be truthfully said of both God and creatures, it's going to do the following. It's going to represent an equal distribution of being to beings. Now note the single quotes, the word being there. This seems to me like a category mistake. Why think of concepts, those things said of other things which other beings satisfy? Why think of those as distributed in any way at all between things? It's not like the concept of being is some commodity, and the commodity is equally given to all things out there. No, the concept of being isn't a commodity at all. It's a predicate. It's something you say of a thing which is satisfied or not satisfied by that thing. So to say it's an equal distribution of something, that something being a concept, the notion of distribution here strikes me as off. That's not what concepts are. That's not what you do with a concept. You don't distribute it. You don't have less when you use it of two things than you had before when you only use it of one. Secondly, look, here they say univocal being is immediately present in everything. Here, univocal being is used as if it's naming an entity. There's a thing out there. It's univocal being. And it's in everything, and it's not more or less in any of the things. But again, that's not quite right either. Univocal is a set of predicates. The predicate being isn't present in anything. You see what I mean? It's the word you use to describe a thing when it exists. That's what being is. And it's not like it's more or less here or there. And it's not like there's something called univocal being which is located in each of us. It's a term said of us. Finally, look at these green bits. There's an implication relation now. The Scotus doctrine of univocity implies that no beings participate more or less in being. And in doing so, it undermines the hierarchy of being. I think that's false too. So the Scotistic doctrine of univocity is a claim about semantics. It's a claim about when words can be used and the ways in which those words are used. It isn't necessarily a claim about the ontology undergirding the semantics. So it's not a claim that requires a certain amount of participation in a thing for it to be a being. But since it doesn't require any sort of ontological gradation, since it doesn't require that there isn't an ontological gradation, it doesn't show that the hierarchy of being is unsatisfied. So those are three things I wanted to say about this. One, it seems to misread what being in the single quotes really is. Being in the single quotes shouldn't name something that's distributed. That's the wrong sort of notion to employ here. Secondly, univocal being is used as if it's a thing which is present in things. But when you say it's univocal, you're talking about how the term is used, and such a thing isn't present in you or me. It's said of you or me, but it's not like a present. It's not like I have 8 units of it and you have 8 units of it. And finally, the Scotistic doctrine of univocity tells us how words are used. It doesn't tell us whether or not things participate in being. The words can be used in one way, and things can participate in a different way. There's no necessary relation between the two. And so you don't have to think the hierarchy of being flattens just because the word being is used in a sparse way where it can be said of anything that exists in any way, no matter what period. Okay, and I've got there. Conclusion. What have I done? Aquinas has a conformity theory of truth, according to which some but not all truths require some existing thing to set their truth value. I said that he claims that some predicates, that is, incarnational and negative predicates, can be said univocally of both God and creatures. Others, such as being or good, cannot be said univocally of God and creatures. And I considered 4 methods of forming predicates that are shareable, that are non-incarnational, and that are positive, that do seem to allow univocity. Third, I said even if some univocity is allowed, we can still agree with Aquinas that analogy is needful for understanding reality better in the science of theology. And there I gave an extended example, or an extended analogy of how to do that. And then finally, last bit, I considered 2 objections to such univocity from postmodern thinkers, and I argue that they both fail. Thanks.